History is the plaything of the social sciences, particularly social sciences like international relations, where we want to know how the world got the way that it did, and then to understand where it might be going in the future. Each of the major perspectives, whether you're looking at it from the standpoint of realism, liberalism, the identity perspective, or one of the critical theory perspectives, sees history as a test bed for their various theories. They're the source of their assumptions, the observations they've made in the past that have led them to their core assumptions, and they're also the place in which we then make predictions about the future. So each of the perspectives views history in a very different way. And the purpose of this mini lecture is to try to introduce the way in which perspectives think about history, whether it's the past, the present, or the future, to understand that history has a very specific meaning in that context. I'll leave it up to the textbook to provide you with a sense of what the perspectives actually think about history, but to understand sort of in general what history means to the perspectives we will examine here. There are 4 learning objectives that you're going to be pursuing as you read the texts and come to class. The first is to be able to understand or list the 3 basic characteristics of the current international system. What is it that today looks like when we talk about the system? Over time, the international system changes. So what is it that defines it as the current system as opposed to international systems of the past? Further, you're going to want to be able to show how history can be seen in different ways. Some see history as a series of cycles. Others see history as sort of a linear progression. And that means in a sense you can't go backwards. You're just kind of making some sort of progress towards some endpoint. Each of the major perspectives, by simplifying the world around us, just as you can criticize the perspectives for missing important things, critical theories in particular criticize the mainstream perspectives for missing things, each of the major perspectives does ignore or sort of demote the importance of certain aspects of history. It's important to know what they're most likely to overlook in that context. And lastly, we want to compare and contrast, explain how the critical theories differ in their view of history from the other perspectives. And it is a remarkably different view of history, going back in large part to the works of Karl Marx and his theories of history, which are very different than sort of how mainstream perspectives view the run of events over time. So keep those 4 objectives in mind as you go forward. But the one thing I want to focus on in this mini lecture is the idea of what history means to IR scholars, to help you to build up to this question of the international system as it exists today being an artifact of various historical processes. So what does history mean to IR scholars? The simple answer is that for IR scholars, history is a sequence of international systems. And over time, the international system has changed, its attributes have changed. And so the theories that we have of international relations, which try to describe, explain, and then in some cases predict international relations, need to be able to do that in the past. And essentially they're cases that we can try to explain, and if it works in past international systems, we then can have a certain degree of confidence that it's going to work for the present international system, and perhaps more importantly, we'll have confidence that it may be able to work for future international systems. Because the international system is not static, it changes over time and along some very important dimensions, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. So the key thing about history is, when we're talking about perspectives on history, what we're talking about is how the international system has been defined in the past, how it's defined in the present, and how it may be defined in the future. Some see it as, again, cyclical, which you'll see, particularly for realism. Some see it as a linear progression from one system to the next, and not really able to go backwards in time to sort of recapture past international systems. So there's a big debate there. And that debate is sort of the distinguishing characteristic of the major perspectives. So keep that in mind as you do your texts. But to go into this in more detail, again, something that your texts don't really necessarily address to directly or very clearly, is if we're talking about history as being as a sort of progression or sort of cycle, however you want to view it, of competing or different international systems over time, what do we mean by an international system? Essentially, an international system has three characteristics, right, that define it as a, sort of as a place to look at the systemic level of analysis. The first is it has to have some kind of structure. There has to be some kind of basic foundational setup for this structure. This may be, some ratio between sort of a full-on anarchy where there's lots of actors and they're sort of clashing with one another, or it could be very hierarchical in the structure in the sense that there may be a really strong global hegemon, some major empire, and they're able to sort of enforce their will on the international system. So you have this range from total anarchy to sort of hierarchy. Your book calls this equilibrium and empire. So you've got this structure. The second major component are the key units. Who are the actors that really dominate or control international events in this particular international system? Today, international relations is largely driven by nation states, but modern nation states really don't begin to form until the Treaty of Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which really marks the sort of modern international state system. Prior to that, you had kingdoms and empires. You had the Holy Roman Empire, which is now the Holy Roman Empire, which was kind of a unique political organization relating between secular and religious authorities with the Catholic Church in Western Europe. You had city-states or leagues, like the Hanseatic League in northern Germany. And so you have all nomadic empires like the Mongols, you had tribes, all these different units. And at different times, they've been the major dominant group that we point to and say, oh, these are the major actors. Today it states, but that isn't always historically the case. International systems can change. Nation states may not always be the dominant actor. And the third thing that's really important to defining an international system, once you have a structure and a core of units that are sort of, that provide the sort of pieces of this structure, you have to look at the political interactions between these particular units. You may have economic and cultural interactions between them, so people know that these other units exist, for example. Maybe there's even some trade going on, but there really has to be some kind of political interaction between them. So, and this is really key to understanding how the world has changed over time, is that political interactions have gotten more and more complicated and more inclusive. So as a consequence, international systems have actually gotten smaller, which again, is sort of ironic, which you'll understand in just a moment, hopefully. So you have these three elements: structure, units, political interaction between them. Economic and cultural interactions don't count. So just because there was trade between, the vast, far off, sort of coast of Asia and, Western Europe, doesn't mean that they were interacting politically for most of their history. They weren't. So, ignore trade, ignore cultural connections, just look at political interactions. Was there meaningful interaction between them on a political dimension? And if there is, then you can consider them part of the same system. If there isn't, then they're distinct. So world history can really be divided into four major periods of time, in terms of, major sort of systems that are important for understanding how IR theory emerged and developed and sort of practiced itself. The first is sort of the ancient period, roughly lasts between 3000 to 500 BCE. The major defining characteristics of this were the sort of, advent of modern, of big civilizations, this, new cities, empires. So you have the Near East, sort of the cradle of civilization. You have the emergence of civilization in India. You have the emergence of civilization in China. Between 500 BCE to 500 CE, sort of the classical era, you have the sort of classical period. This is sort of the rise of the city-states and various empires in the Mediterranean, the sort of beginnings of Western civilization, sort of the foundations of Western civilization in Greece and Rome that we understand today. The rise of the Persian Empire, India and China, continue to be very important, global civilizations. The medieval period is between roughly 500 to 1500 CE. This is the advent of feudalism in Europe, the significant changing in sort of the structure of international affairs. The Western Roman Empire fails, but you have for another 1,000 years the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. You have the Islamic Empire. which are some of the most powerful at the time. You have the Chinese Empire, which at the time and sort of its zenith was the most powerful empire in the world, and then you have the Mongols, who conquered the most territory in history and actually clashed and brought sort of several international systems together by creating the political interactions, right, that previously had not really happened. There were some economic and cultural ties, but the Mongols basically came pouring out of Asia and into the Islamic empires and into Western Europe, and as a consequence, Eastern Europe and into Western Europe, and as a result, brought all of those disparate areas together in a way that had not previously been the case. And then you have from 1500, roughly, actually 1492, which I'll talk about here in a moment, you have the modern system, which really begins to grow and build. You don't have the modern state system until 1648, but you have the spread of European imperialism and a number of things happen. So the modern period is a little bit different. One of the key things that distinguishes the classical, the medieval, the ancient sort of time periods from sort of the modern system is that they were distinguished by having multiple international systems. That can be really hard for students to sort of grasp this idea that you might have multiple international systems all going on at the same time, right? Because there's only one planet. The problem is that prior to some of the interactions, like the Mongols, for example, or most importantly, Christopher Columbus, sailing to the New World in 1492, you have a situation where there was no meaningful political interaction among disparate parts of the world. So each of those disparate parts of the world basically constituted their own international system. There were different actors that were important and that engaged in international relations, but they didn't know or didn't engage in any meaningful way politically with actors in other systems. It isn't until those systems are pulled together that you end up having the number of international systems shrinking. So several international systems can exist simultaneously as long as there's no meaningful political interaction between them. So again, when the Mongols came pouring out of the Asian steppes into the Middle East and then later into Eastern Europe and Western Europe, they brought with them, right, their international system, and basically then you have clash of worlds coming together. It's not until Christopher Columbus brought the age of European conquest in the New World to started it. Do you have a meaningful interaction between Western Europe and the various indigenous cultures in North America? So some key examples historically of this, around 0 CE, you have both Rome and the Chinese empires existing side by side, but they have no meaningful interaction. They know that each other exists in a very loose sense, but beyond that, it's just they're simply not related in any meaningful way. So two separate systems. The Roman Empire's world, Rome was hegemonic in its territory, China was hegemonic in its territory, and they didn't interact in any. It wasn't like superpowers, or rivals, wasn't bipolar. It was two separate international systems that were both unipolar at their time. Around 1500, when you have the beginning, right, of prior to the Christopher Columbus, Europe constituted its own international system. The Islamic world constituted its own international system. East Asia, China, the Mongol Empire constituted its own system. The Americas were largely its own system. Really, North and South America were sort of separate systems, and then you have Africa, which is kind of its own system, this dark spot on the map. But then after that, the Europeans then sort of spread out and sort of connect all of these pieces together, and they become a single international system. So throughout history, again, international systems have varied in some very important ways. And the questions we ask basically are, how different is the structure? Right? What's the polarity of these different international systems? We look at how structurally and functionally similar the units are. Was this a system where you had one big empire and a bunch of little stinky little city-states? Or was this an area where mostly tribes? What's the overlap there? And then lastly, one of the more important questions, again, that leads to sort of the different observations that different perspectives makes is what kind of rules sort of have primacy? What's the norm? that's operating in this system? Is it a normal sort of self-help, right, which is the idea of force? It's like whoever's the most powerful determines what's going on, or is it more about the norms of reciprocity and rules that there's sort of behaviors that everyone's expected to follow, and if you follow them, then everybody gets along pretty well. There are some systems that force was the major language, and there are systems where the rules were the major language, and again, it's not 100%. There's always a little bit of force, a little bit of rules, but in the end, there's sort of systems that are defined as being more anarchical than others. And this thing gets us to where we are today. The modern international system, the thing that distinguishes the system today from all those various systems in the past, is first, this is truly the first global international system. In other words, it covers the entire planet. And it has grown in terms of the complexity. Some scholars will say that really we've had a couple of different international systems. So you had sort of the international system prior, to a global international system prior to the Treaty of Westphalia, and then you have sort of a system that emerges after that, and then you have sort of one that happens a little bit later on, perhaps, based on the power of Britain and the United States. But the reality is that we have either one or a handful, depending on how you look at it, one single international system at a time at the moment, and that means it's global. And complex interdependence, a concept that we'll talk about later when we get to globalization, is an example of sort of this idea that the relationships we have are so embedded and so deep that it truly is a unique international system compared to the past. The second, again, looking at structural and functional similarity among units, there's this notion that over time, the units all become roughly the same structurally, functionally, and that is this idea that today states are the key actor. That may change. It certainly wasn't the case in the past, but that's the key where it is now. And the third thing is that the current international system is defined by sort of an anarchical structure, sort of a mix of force and rules. Whereas, again, some systems have been more forceful than what we have today, and there have been systems in the past which have been more based on rules than what we have today. Although we're getting to a point where, the rules are probably more advanced in certain regions than at any point in world history. But we have anarchy, right? It's a global system dominated by states, and it's anarchical. Those are the three key things that define the modern state system. One last thing, and again, we've got this idea. Those are the three things you really need to know from this mini lecture. Is again the notion that the international system today is defined by its totality, right? It's a global international system. It's defined by the cohesiveness of its structures and of its major units, structurally, functionally, which are states, and then it's also defined by its anarchical nature. But the key thing to understand how we got there is sort of this, little infographic here, where we have Christopher Columbus here sailing from the old world, which basically, constituted one international system, into the new world, which was not a part of that international system. And by doing that, Christopher Columbus was able to then bridge the gap and create a single international system. Christopher Columbus was not the first European to come to the New World. That was actually the Vikings, which arrived, or technically the Norsemen. Vikings were just the name of their warriors. But they settled briefly in part of Newfoundland and Canada. But again, the important thing is that even though they were aware of the New World and then settled there, there was no meaningful political interaction between Newfoundland and the Old World, and the Vikings left very relatively quickly after they came. They were only there for a few years. So as a consequence, it took until their concerted effort by the Spanish under Columbus to establish colonies in the New World, and then they spread very, very, very quickly to cause those systems to come together. There has to be meaningful political interaction. And Columbus, even though he's not technically the first, didn't really discover it because there were a whole bunch of people here before, including the indigenous population. What Columbus did is bring together those two worlds, and now you have a single international system. So as you look at the perspectives, views of history, you want to try to understand how this happened from the standpoint of what are the key events that led up to this fusion of the international system into one international system as opposed to several distinct international systems.